part of today covering tribal programs under the jurisdiction of Interior Environment Appropriations Subcommittee. This morning, we heard about critical health care issues facing Native Americans both on and off the reservation. This afternoon, we'll be focusing on issues relating to land trust, natural resource management, including climate change. And once again, we'll hear testimony from distinguished tribal leaders who are truly experts in this issue, so we thank you for being here. This afternoon's issues are components of Native culture, of religion, are integral to the very survival of individual Indians who rely on the resources for substance as well as economic activity. Indian country lacks the tax base enjoyed by other governments, so funding provided by the federal government is essential to their economic development. So we are happy to have you here. We're going to start taking testimony. I'll just go over a couple of things. Only pictures and recordings are taken with individuals that hold press credentials. So we've noticed everybody for that. And we have a timer here. We have 5 minutes for your testimony. We're going to have you introduce yourselves because we found out that gave us a little bit of extra time. Introduce yourself, go right into your testimony. We will not count your introduction against your time. So Janet's got her, she's ready to go. When the light turns yellow, there's a minute left. When it turns red, we will ask you to wrap up your testimony. We will have a series of votes this afternoon, probably in about a half an hour, so we should be able to get through all of your testimony with that. And then votes could, like half hour, 45 minutes. I'm hearing Mr. Stewart.
Yes.
You're hearing the same thing.
Yes,
And when after that happens, I will be going over to speak at the National Conference of Americans Indian. So Ms. Pingree will be filling in as vice chair, as chair for me while I'm gone. So let us start out with you, Mr. Norris. Please introduce yourself and then go right into your testimony. Thank you for being here. Thank all of you for being here.
Thank you for the opportunity. Good afternoon, Chairwoman McCollin, Ranking Member Joyce, and distinguished subcommittee members. I'm Ned Norris Jr. I'm the chairman of the Tohono Nation, a tribe with more than 34,000 members in southern Arizona. Our reservation is one of the largest in the country, encompassing more than 2.8 million acres. We share a 62-mile border with Mexico, which is the longest southern international border of any tribe in the United States. Thank you again for this opportunity to testify. So, first I would like to address our roads. BIA Roads Maintenance Program is chronically underfunded. The nation has 735 miles of BIA roads, the 6th largest total mileage in Indian country. Of these roads, many of these roads are badly damaged and poorly maintained by the BIA. Monsoon rains and flooding and heavy usage by the Border Patrol vehicles have resulted in terrible reservation road conditions. During monsoon season, flooding washes our bridges, isolates communities, strands our children on school buses, and prevents access for emergency vehicles. Congress has failed to provide adequate funding for BIA reservation roads. We urge the subcommittee to increase funding to address this serious safety issue. To address the damage to our roads done by Border Patrol vehicles, the FY18 appropriations law provided for the transfer of funds from Border Patrol to BIA for repair of reservation roads. Some of that funding is currently being used to repair one of our roads heavily used by the Border Patrol, which will protect tribal and federal law enforcement and tribal members. We are grateful to the subcommittee for addressing this critical issue and for including similar language in FY19 and 20. But many of our roads need work, and we ask that the language permitted the BIA to accept funding from Border Patrol be included in the FY21 Interior Appropriations Bill. Next, our water settlement. The nation faces a serious and imminent water crisis because the nation's Southern Arizona Water Settlement Act is not being funded. The act authorized up to $32 million to pay for delivery of water to the nation and directed Interior to tell Congress how much funding would be necessary to implement the settlement. Interior has never requested any of the funds. As a result, Reclamation estimates that our settlement may run out of funding in the very near future, forcing closure of tribal farms, employee layoffs, crops, loan defaults, and breach of related agreements. We urge Congress to provide for a long-term, stable funding source for Indian water settlements. A long-term funding source will provide tribes with fiscal certainty and ensure timely implementation of water settlements. Next, law enforcement. The nation faces unique law enforcement and public safety challenges. Tribal police patrol remote areas that are difficult to access, and radio communication with other law enforcement agencies is unreliable. Our officers face serious and unnecessary safety risks. A significant amount of the nation's limited law enforcement resources are dedicated to border security. The nation has a long-standing relationship with Border Patrol and other federal law enforcement agencies, but we still spend millions of our own dollars, a third of our police department budget every year to help meet federal border security responsibilities. The nation's police regularly investigate immigrant death and pay for costly autopsies with no federal assistance. We also incur costs from border-related damages to our reservation, including removal of abandoned vehicles and control of wildland fires caused by illegal activity. Our correctional facility is too small to hold the detainees our police apprehend. We urge Congress to provide increased federal funding for tribal law enforcement programs, to improve communications, hire and train additional officers, purchase vehicles, meet border security obligations, and improve tribal correctional facilities. Finally, healthcare funding. The nation's hospital is one of the oldest IHS facilities and is inadequate to meet our needs. We waited more than 20 years for IHS construction funding. In the last 2 years, we began to receive funding for replacement hospital, but in FY20, no additional funding was provided. Substantial increases for IHS facilities construction budget are needed in FY21. Thank you. The nation appreciates the subcommittee's efforts to provide Indian country with much needed resources in this challenging fiscal time. I am happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Chairwoman and subcommittee members and representative from the state of Utah. My name is Sean Chapoose. I'm a council member of the Ute Indian Tribe, also a member of the Ute Indian Tribe representing the Kapogri Band. So we appreciate the work to defend funding for Indian programs. These programs are based on our treaties and United States trust responsibility to Indian tribes. The subcommittee and Congress are responsible for making sure that the United States lives up to its words and laws of the land. The Ute Indian Tribe asked that the subcommittee increase funding for Indian energy development, justice systems, and health care. These are some of the most important programs on our Uinta and Ouray reservation and across Indian country. Indian energy development provides stable long-term economic resources. Energy development funds our tribal government and the services we provide our members. It creates thousands of good-paying jobs and supports the development of infrastructure on our reservation. Our reservation is located in northeastern Utah. It is the second largest reservation in the United States. We use cutting-edge technologies to develop our energy resource and manage our lands and resources. By being proactive, we can be a major energy producer while also protecting our environment and homelands. Using our management techniques, we have about 7,000 wells producing 45,000 barrels of oil a day. We also produce more than 900 million cubic feet of gas per day. We have been producing oil and gas for more than 70 years. Meanwhile, we also protect our homelands and are one of the first tribes to develop a management plan for endangered species on our reservation. The President should be supporting our proactive management efforts, but every year he proposes cutting funding for every program needed to approve energy permits. The subcommittee must reject his proposal and increase funding for Indian energy programs. The President is also trying to consolidate or eliminate important programs that support Indian energy development. For example, there's a proposal to move the Office of Indian Energy and Economic Development within BIA. We oppose this move. The Office of Indian Energy and Economic Development is not a permitting agency like BIA. The office provides funding and technical support to tribes. The office works at the Assistant Secretary level and is able to move funds and staff quickly to address the needs of tribes in changing market conditions. For example, just a few years ago, our BIA agency was buried under an energy permitting backlog. This backlog limited our ability to produce oil and gas and limited our revenues. To solve the problem and get permits flowing, The office provided teams of energy experts that were able to reduce BIA backlogs. BIA should focus on its core mission of processing energy permits. BIA needs staff and expertise in its agency, offices to support permitting on the ground. BIA also needs full funding for its Indian Energy Service Center in Denver. BIA has a different mission than the Office of Indian Energy and Economic Development. Finally, we ask that you protect funding for the Department of Energy's Tribal Loan Guarantee Program. The President keeps trying to eliminate this program. This is the only federal program that helps tribes access capital for commercial-scale energy projects. In my remaining time, I want to stress the importance of funding for tribal justice systems and health care. We've done our part. We've used $36 million of our own funds to build a new justice center. We also revise our law and order code to get tough on gangs and drugs. But we can't enforce our laws because BIA lacks the funding to fully staff the Justice Center. Instead, BIA uses federal funds to put offenders in county jails. Even worse, BIA tells our tribal judge to slow enforcement of warrants because BIA is running out of money to put offenders in county jails. This means they are released back into our communities. We have a similar problem in the area of health care. Again, we're being forced to use tribal revenues to contract or construct a new village and dialysis center. There's a little visual for you to look at. It's on the reservation. It's a elder dialysis center because we're funding that ourselves. All right. IHS says this is it is authorized to do a dialysis center treatment, but Congress is not providing the funds. Instead, IHS uses our referred care funding to send tribal patients to non-Indian dialysis centers. We estimate the cost $43,000 per patient per month. In addition, our dialysis staff are forced to spend time transporting patients rather than caring for them. This makes no sense. Congress must provide the funding needed for tribal justice systems and health care. Congress should also direct agencies to use federal funds at tribal facilities, not in border towns. The Union Tribe asks the subcommittee to focus its efforts on funding on Indian energy, justice system, and health care. We need your support in each of these areas. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. I'm willing to answer any questions you may have.
Good afternoon. My name is Chairwoman McCollum and ranking members of the subcommittee. My name is Shannon Holsey. I'm the president of the Stockbridge-Muncie community. It's my pleasure to be here today to provide testimony on behalf of my people with regards to the need for mandatory appropriations to the Bureau of Indian Affairs and certainly the critically important process of taking land to trust. As many tribal governments, mine is no different from regards to our membership largely relies upon the combination of federal funding and gaming dollars. For my community, the Stockbridge-Muncie, our tribal government budget comes from gaming dollars, and the funding source allows for not only expansion of services for healthcare, our police department, our emergency responders, and also funding for our membership for education and training opportunities. This is why time is of the essence for the funding of the federal government that will allow our tribal governments to invest in a diversified economy. Being able to plan years in advance due to stable federal government funding of its trust responsibilities to tribes allows tribes to engage in long-term planning and financial stability that is crucial for a successful diversified economic project. In 2019, I don't need to tell you, the government shutdown was the longest in the United States history and is only most recent the example of federal budget processes that jeopardize not only our health, safety, and well-being of our tribal citizens. Tribal nations must regularly overcome uncertainty when planning and providing services to the citizens because of the political impasses related to federal spending. For instance, since 1998, there has only been 1 year in 2006 in which the Interior, Environment, and related agencies' appropriation bills has been enacted before the beginning of the new fiscal year. Often, the partisan debates affecting the appropriations process has an outsized impact on the daily lives of our people who already face underfunding healthcare, education, backlogs of physical infrastructure, all of which all fall under the federal trust responsibility. Congress must prevent political impasses from jeopardizing the provision of adequate quality services in tribal communities such as healthcare, law enforcement, and child welfare by passing legislation authorizing advanced appropriations for Indian Health Services and the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And I also want to thank Chairwoman McCollum for the proposed current legislation, the Indian Program's Advanced Appropriations, which I think will play a significant role in stabilizing our government. Also, the Indian Health Services Advanced Appropriations, which is much needed for the appropriations of Indian Health Services and our Indian Health Facilities accounts. The best way Congress, and specifically the community, can assist in driving diversified economic development in Indian country is by you all have been doing your part with the extraordinary job of finding many years and many ways to provide funding for our tribal needs, often exceeding the administration budget. This is very much appreciated, and it's clear that you all recognize the need that we have and the trust and treaty responsibilities of the United States. Unfortunately, the pressures of federal discretionary budget are great and increasing and will allow the impact to provide the necessary funding we need to stabilize our tribal governments. To illustrate the need for this, we need adequate appropriations, but most importantly, the land to trust application, which can obviously be very, very cumbersome, especially as it relates to the regulations currently outlined in separate processes for on-reservation and off-reservation applications, as well as the administration appeal that can at least take 2 levels of administration. I feel the appropriations of this fee to trust process must be mandatory, specifically because the federal government has a trust and treaty responsibility, but also because of the time constraints that are associated with this. Ideally, it takes 1 to 2 years, but in our instance, it has taken sometimes from 9 to 10 years in most instances because of the 2 application fee to trust process, which also gives the validity of the local municipalities and townships to weigh in with the appeal process that causes pending implications to that. So I will say this, I shared the background specifically because of the complexity of it and also because of the multi-year process need to create consistent appropriations, not only for the purposes of the tribes, but also to ensure the staff has time and the necessary time and attention that's needed for the federal government to fulfill their obligations. We also need funding and adequate staffing of trained federal employees at all levels of the fee to trust process to keep it moving smoothly and quickly. For example, we suspect the processing of fee to trust applications will slow at our agency because of current staffing issues or limitations to staff. That we had previous 2 employees working now, they have been vacated and they're moved to a new region. So with that said, I thank you very much for your time and your consideration.
Good afternoon, Chair McCollum and ranking members. My name is Fred Fox. I'm an elected councilman on the governing body of the Tribal Business Council of the MHA Nation, serving as the representative for the White Shield segment on the 3 affiliated tribes of Fort Berthold Reservation. Our chairman, Mark Fox, could not travel to be here today, so he asked me to testify on his behalf and behalf of our MHA Nation. Our recent good news at MHA Nation has also created bad news. The MHA Nation has experienced an explosion of economic activity on our reservation in recent years from oil and gas production. That growth has brought with it an explosion of our reservation population. Combined, our phenomenal growth has completely stressed our reservation infrastructure beyond its breaking points. Years of BIA neglect of our roads, bridges, and public safety programs is now compounded by the pressure of rapid growth. We not only need to replace our old transportation facilities, we also must expand transportation system to accommodate our growth. The MHA Nation is in the middle of the Bakken Formation, with one of the most active and productive oil and gas formations in the United States. Much of our infrastructure needs to come from the pressure of the heavy equipment traffic necessary for oil and gas work. The intense congestion on our poorly designed roadways possesses an increasing threat to our reservation highway safety. In the next decade, we estimate the MHA Nation will need $3.6 billion to repair our transportation system and keep pace with our projected growth. We need increased federal funding to support reservation public safety at Fort Berthold. Our tribal law enforcement officers already handle 14,000 calls each year, and our crime rate is growing as fast as our economic development. Without more funding from federal law enforcement resources, we cannot handle the influx of unsavory characters and drug dealers that is flooding our reservation as our economy expands. We built our own drug treatment facility, but need operational funding to go along with additional funding for many more police officers, investigators, drug counselors, and the equipment to support their work. The solution is not just mere federal money. The MHA Nation has committed much of its new resources to building our reservation and making it a safe and healthy place for our people. But our capacity to help ourselves is hobbled by the dual taxation that keeps our tribal government from realizing the fair and full benefit of all this economic development activity on our lands. The state of North Dakota taxation of our reservation resources diverts our reservation money away from solving our reservation challenges. It is a long past time for the Congress to change federal law that now allows the state of North Dakota to place a dual tax in addition to the tribe's own tax on the development of energy resources within the Fort Berthold Reservation. So long as this federal law stands unchanged, our efforts at solving our problems will be sharply limited, and you will find our reasonable request for additional funding unbearably high. We ask you to work with the other committees of Congress, including the Ways and Means Committee, to eradicate this mistaken federal policy that permits North Dakota to impose a dual tax on tribal resource development, as North Dakota piles up billions of dollars in its legacy and rainy day funds. That tribal money should be left with our tribe to spend on our reservation roads, law enforcement, healthcare, housing, and other infrastructure so critically needed by our citizens. If the subcommittee invests now in additional federal funding and simultaneously compels the Congress to end dual taxation, our MHA Nation will be able to make our reservation a safer place to live. It will also significantly reduce our need to keep coming back to you for more federal funding in the future. Thank you for this opportunity to testify.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Stewart?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And for all of you, thank you for being here. It was, I think, a great panel. You bring up different issues than many of the others have, at least in the time I've been able to be here. And Mr. Fox, I'm going to say something very quickly to you, then you'll forgive me. Mr. Chapus, I want to spend a primary amount of my time with you, both of us coming from Utah and the Pride Ute tribe. Tell me, give us a sense of what, you sit on one of the largest, as you said, one of the largest oil fields in the United States. You talked about this has been a good thing, but a bad thing. It's brought its challenges. On the whole, has this been good for you, and what has it meant to the tribes you talked about some of the challenges, but what has it meant in a positive fashion as well?
The positive fashion is not only have we, have increased, I guess, activity and crime and road damage to our federal roads. We've also had really good resources put into education. We've built several new schools on our reservation. Our reservation had schools built back in 1957 and 1958 when we were flooded by the Pick-Sloan Act. And our schools were probably 60 to 70 years old at the time, and so most of our communities have had the opportunity to have new schools in.
Do you have trouble recruiting teachers and staffing your schools?
That is one of the bigger problems, because a lot of the teachers would like school housing, and we're not able to offer that housing to give them. But we are slowly getting ahead on the game, trying to provide that housing. But it's a long time coming.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Sean, if I could, you said something about dialysis, for example. You talked about some of the medical needs, and I think you said it was $43,000 a month per person. Is that true?
Yes.
What do you think, if you were to provide your own facilities, what do you think it would cost you then? How much could you save by doing what you guys would hope to do? And that's.
Well, I don't think that you're going to save nothing. It's just that federal dollars right now that normally would be infused to help the tribe itself, they're being spent off reservation. So with our tribe in particular, we're in a position where we're going to commit our own dollars to build this facility. But if you don't fund the federal side of it, it's kind of like you've got the greatest building in the world, but you have no way of operating it, right? And it kind of goes along with, like I stated before, we've built a justice center, a $38 million justice center, state of the art. But it still requires.
And you did that like this facility with your own internal
Yes,
dollars?
we've always, because we understand the need, and our tribe, we're fortunate, we're an oil and gas tribe.
Yeah.
But we've also realized that sometimes we're not going to get that assistance from the federal government. So we have an obligation as tribal leaders to use our resource And so we do that with the understanding that, we're going to come back here to the federal level, and they're going to help at least staff provide the agreement they made with us. But when it comes down to it, what happens is usually them funds are cut first. They take them off.
Yeah.
So we're committing our own dollars to fulfill the obligation that we created when we ceded our lands and stuff, right? And it's frustrating, but at the same time, we know it's important. But we rely on you guys at this level to, to remind them that tribes are putting forth efforts, and you have your responsibility on your side to at least provide them services and quit cutting them.
Yeah. I appreciate that. And I want to clarify one thing. In this facility that you showed us a map, did you have some dialysis rooms in that building?
Yeah, this particular one actually goes beyond just dialysis center. It was an elder facility and a dialysis center.
Yeah.
And so when we do it, because, when you start spending them type of dollars, addressing one need doesn't solve your problem. So when you have the opportunity, you attempt to, capture all of it. And what you'll find is most of the dialysis patients happen to be the elderly people of the reservation. And I think this is a real important discussion is the healthcare system isn't designed to actually keep them healthy. It's designed to keep them alive,
Yeah.
if you want to be truthful. And so a lot of the diabetes that we're starting to encounter on reservations is due to the inadequate health service itself. So we're trying to address the elder population as well as the diabetes and other programs in that one facility.
And let me do one more very quickly if I could. And I think it mostly concerns some tribes in the southern Utah, but they may be some of your band as well, and I don't know the answer, and maybe you could help me understand that. But in southern Utah, we had many EMS services, helicopter services that were providing rescue and emergency evacuation to the tribal territories. But I mean, my gosh, it was a long way to go, and it's in some cases the only way they could get someone who was in emergency. I just didn't have time to go over the roads and others, and they've had to cut back just because, as I think you probably know, some of the reimbursement rates just weren't sufficient for them, and that was through BIA. Have you experienced those same problems? I think in northern Utah you probably haven't, but I just want to confirm that hasn't been a thing for you.
I don't think we have the same problem because you're talking more like the Navajo Nation down in that
Yeah.
rural area where, they're still running
In the
them
Four
two
Corners
tracks.
area, yeah.
They're still got the unimproved road system.
Yeah.
But we feel the same impacts, not the same way they do, but the simple fact is the cost associated with providing service has not kept up with the economics of the service. And so what happens is they have limited dollars, and so they kind of pick and choose what meets the criteria under the pot of money they have. So somebody gets lost in the cracks. And then when you expend dollars, like if our tribe was to put money out, then we have to fight tooth and nail to actually recover what we put out. So, it's interesting how you're still operating or trying to provide a service, but cutting the dollars that provide it and not taking into account the cost associated with it. So,
All right, thank you. I yield back, Madam Chair.
I've got a couple of different ones. Could I ask both you and Mr. Fox about the administration's proposed removal of the Division of Energy and Mineral Development to put it under the BIA? I'm assuming, I should assume that you were consulted on that. You're shaking your head no. Tell me how that's, I mean, obviously you know why it's not going to work, and you're supposed to be consulted?
well, I'll go first. The consultation we received was we went to a listening session yesterday.
Oh, yesterday?
Yeah, I actually, the first word I heard about it was yesterday. I was at the NCI thing, so there was a listening session. Well, you know as well as me, listening sessions aren't consultation. So they proposed it, they had their great plan in front of us, and then they proceeded to tell us, but by the way, we have all these scheduled consultations in various locations, and if you really feel the need, you need to attend them here. Well, the dilemma with that is Indian country is big. We all know this, right? And like a consultation location, are going to put the cost for me to attend that and then get in a room where you got everybody in a room, chances of actually getting something forward, it don't go nowhere. And so we will constantly stress this, that true consultation from the agencies needs to occur at the tribal level. They need to go to each tribe, because we're not the same. We have different, issues and stuff, but they really need to take the time to go to the tribes themselves and have true and formal consultation. But the only thing like I stated was, I went to the meeting and the way they peddled it to me was more or less it was a done deal. We were just there for the show. So,
Mr. Fox?
That office, with the Office of Indian Energy, that was, I guess, it was one of our main offices for having a petroleum engineer. And when we have petroleum engineers inside that office, it gives us access to many, maps and I guess, their views on our reservation, on development and where it's going, and how they can give us their expert opinions, and giving us that that resource that is much needed in Indian country. We don't have that availability to hire petroleum engineers and all these staffing on our reservation, and not every petroleum engineer is going to say, "Hey, I want to work in Fort Berthold. I want to work where
Right.
there's nothing going. There's no housing, or so it's tough for us when we're losing, an office with petroleum engineers and other technical staff, and then put it under the Bureau of Indian Affairs, where it gets pretty much, swept under the rug. And a lot of times, it's a major office that we're losing, and with a reservation with 1,700 wells that were developed in the last 5 years, it's a major hit to us.
Well, I wish I could say it's surprising, but it's not. We went through this with the Department of Interior reorganization. I'm sure you were not consulted on what's happening now with BLM, with their relocation. And this committee's made it very, very clear to the administration when they're to follow the law, which is consultation. And so, and then they just figure out, recently they figured out they just do it. They just move things on their own and move money around on their own. And we're trying to put a stop to that because we want the law to be followed. And when we appropriate money in certain accounts, especially in Indian country, we expect that that's where it's going to go after hearing from your testimony. So thank you for that. And as I had mentioned earlier, one of the reasons why I like doing this at this time early is so that when the administration is before us and defending the president's budget, we can pass on your questions, concerns, and comments. Mr. Norris, I wanted to ask you, it appears to me you've got a real good handle on how much it's costing you to supplement, you're supplementing what Customs and Border Patrol is not doing. Have you ever, what would happen? I know it wouldn't be a good thing for the tribe if you stopped it from not happening, but if you weren't there doing it, Customs and Border Patrol would have to do it, would they not?
Well, I would
I
expect.
mean, if you just said, if you were to say to them, we're going to give you access to be in our land to carry out your things, but your mission, but we're not going to do it. I'm trying to figure out how to get the funding back to you, because you shouldn't be supplanting federal U.S. Customs and Border. It should be transferred back, and Congress has kind of talked about doing it, but it appears it's not happening. A 30-year police force, the roads, other things like that. So you've got a pretty good handle on the accounting on that?
Yes, we do. And it's, at least for law enforcement, we're, like I said, spending about a third of the law enforcement budget, which is about $1.6 million annually. The autopsies that we're having to deal with are about 2,600 per autopsy, and there could be a variety of autopsies in one particular month. But as far as you would expect that, we would expect that the Border Patrol would assume a lot of that responsibility. But unless they have, my experience has been, and I've worked for my nation for over 40 years now, and this is my third term as tribal chairman dealing with this, and it's sort of like if they don't have a physical body, a live body to deal with, or if they've got migrants that are needing medical attention, they basically take them to the Indian Health Service hospital and basically leave them there. And then we're obligated to provide the medical care attention to those migrants. As far as the autopsies, if they've got a deceased migrant out that they've recovered the body on, that they don't assume any of that responsibility. And Many times it's important for to put some closure to whether it was a medical issue, whether it was exposure issue, or whatever the cause of death was. And so many times, if not always, those deaths are turned over to the nation's responsibility.
Well,
That'd be, you've given me food for thought. I want to find out if the border states, in fact, are getting reimbursed back, or if the states are absorbing the cost. Because and I don't know this, I don't serve on that committee, they're right next door to us, I'm gonna find out. If the states are reimbursed, if they are reimbursed, you certainly, as a tribal nation under sovereignty, you should be reimbursed.
And the whole issue with regards to the roads conditions, which are, I mean, the Border Patrol has increased significantly on our tribal reservation, and there's pros and cons about that. You've
Right.
got members that have accepted and those that haven't. But for the most part, they are the primary use of our BIA roads, and they wear and tear the roads more so than our own tribal members do. And so, part of the question was a legal question. Because we would try and do what we could do to work with the Border Patrol to try and fill potholes, to try and do some maintenance on the roads. And many times the Bureau would come back and say, well, you're creating a liability for us, for the Bureau, because it's a federal Indian reservation road. And if we, as a tribal entity, try to do some maintenance, it's creating the liability. But we've always known that they're not gonna have the resources necessary. So even if we try to work out, and we have in the past, an arrangement with the Border Patrol where maybe the nation's community would buy the asphalt and the Border Patrol agrees to fill the potholes, that's still a liability that's created. And so it's kind of a catch-21. We're danged if we do and we're danged if we don't. And so one of the ways was when the language was put in the FY18 budget, which basically allowed for the Border Patrol and the BIA to receive some of those fundings to help maintain the roads. That's helped out quite a bit, but the problem is much more significant. We're only addressing one road, one federal route at this point. We got 735 miles of federal BIA roads. And I would say that the majority of those roads are being traveled and used by the Border Patrol themselves, which damage the road and create this problem for us.
Mr. Chairwoman, yield for a moment.
Yeah.
I agree with their contention on this reimbursement. I'm wondering, have you ever requested reimbursement, and what has been the response?
We have raised the concern. We have spoke before different committees. We have spoke before our congressional delegation, and we just haven't gotten anywhere until the FY18, which helps a little bit.
Anything you want to add?
No, I appreciate the fortitude of this committee and the members. I thank you for joining us this morning at NCAI, but we understand the good work that you're doing, so whatever we can do. I appreciated the questions you asked about the quantification, because it is the economics of things oftentimes, and so the questions you asked the panel with regards to that is very helpful. So whatever we can do to quantify or extrapolate that information is very helpful for us too.
Mr. Amade?
Thank you, Madam Chair. President Holsey, you were talking about from fee from trust to fee and all that, so that's something that the folks in my neck of the woods have had a problem with real estate.
Right.
And the problem that they've had is, it's like, okay, you've paid your deal off, and so you're waiting for it to be conveyed.
Right,
And you're waiting,
and waiting.
and you're waiting, and it's like, well, it's your property, supposedly, but I can't go get a loan on it if the title's not in my name.
Right.
And so my question is, if anybody can pipe up here, but I want to start with you, since some of this is about land, is, I mean, we've had lag times from 5 to 10 years, and this is a simple lot.
Right.
This is not large amounts, casinos, anything else like that. It's just, hey, I now own a piece of ground that I can build a home on.
Right. Well, it creates an infrastructure problem because of that delay or delayed response to that, because it's the multi-faceted, multi-analysis of putting fee to trust. So With that said, you continue to pay the taxes on that land until it becomes trust. So there's still the economics of it.
So what's your time frame, though, in your
Ours on
experience?
average is 10 years, because we have the local municipalities that oppose and appeal. So there's an appellate process that continues on for years. And then, of course, when you have, when you have vulnerability within the agency, because there's either lack of staff to do it, to process it, or
So
they've
when you
moved.
say the agency, so my people go through Phoenix and Albuquerque.
Our regional office is in Ashland,
Okay.
but then, but
So it's not different in that neck of the woods than it is in mine.
no, but they've just shifted. There's been a significant shift of the staff. For example, we had a regional agent. She's a tribal member named Kim Bouchard. She was with our agency since she started. Now they moved her to the Nashville region. But I'm under the auspice that perhaps it's intentional, because then it creates more chaos, it takes more time, and there's not the continuity that once existed, or the relationship working with your agency partners in order to facilitate that. Because, in the rulemaking process, they have that ability to appeal, and we keep telling them we're not sub-sovereigns to the state or a local municipality, we're sovereigns. So there's always that issue or challenge associated with it. So you're talking about, you can't really make any plans, because you figure if it's 10 years, I can't create it or deem it for agricultural purposes, for economic development or anything else, because.
You paid for it, but you don't own it of
Absolutely.
record.
Absolutely.
So is it fair to say that you're experiencing the same problem in your region or whatever?
It depends. There are some tribes, based on the municipality or the
That do
county
their
they
own?
live in. Yeah,
Yeah.
so.
There's some in Southern California. How about the rest of you chairmen here?
I would just like to comment that we're not in a predicament right now that has been described, but I can share with you that even under mandatory acquisitions, where you've got a settlement, under mandatory and settlement, and the language is that you shall take the land into trust. Even in our first settlement acquisition of land, that process where the language was, you shall take the land into trust and it shall be deemed a federal Indian reservation for all intended purposes. Our first acquisition under our settlement law took 10 years, even though it was a mandatory acquisition.
Okay.
So, I'm not sure why it took so long for that first acquisition to take place, but that was our experience.
Yes, Chairman.
We've been dealing with the land and trust issue forever, and it does take forever. I mean, children are born before it happens, right? And what happens is, for like our tribe, for instance, a large tribe, we have a mineral ownership below. We purchase the surface. So you're trying to consolidate. You're trying to make yourself whole, right? And in Utah, what you always got to remember is you got jurisdictional issues that are created over ownerships. So you're trying to consolidate land to define boundaries so that we're better to have law enforcement stuff. But because the land into trust process is so cumbersome, it just takes one person out of the blue to throw a wrench in the gear. And then at tribes who are limited on resource to begin with, right? I mean, some of them are expending a lot of money to acquire these acreages because they're in critical locations. And so our experience has been, it's a mess, right? And it was always written into the law, in 1934, actually, the land in the trust policy existed. And we're one of them tribes that was part of that. So you're thinking, well, you got a clear route, but it does not exist. And you just run to roadblock after roadblock.
And I appreciate that.
Mr. Amity, I want to let Mr. Kilmer get a
Yep,
question.
just
before we leave.
one real quick. When you referred to the briefing you got about oil and gas, who was briefing you?
Actually, it was some people from I think it was the EMD side,
Okay.
their staff.
Of
I-
Interior?
Yeah, and I think what's funny is because I think people forgot when that was introduced, our tribe was one of the pivotal riders to try to create this quicker permitting system.
Right, I
So we
remember.
figured this all out, and now they're reinventing the wheel, and then we'll end up going back, and then to move archives and the technology that he's talking about, all you're doing is delaying the process even more. So.
Yeah, I agree. Mr. Kilmer? Okay, well, the hearing stands adjourned into the call of the chair after the last votes. Oh, I'm sorry, recess, that's right. We're not adjourned, we're in recess until the last vote and the chair comes back. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Say that, but I said it wrong.
Well done.
worst nightmare Amity's coming back as well.
Oh, my goodness. Well, there's some levity then, you know? She doesn't introduce people, right? She just lets them go ahead.
And then we don't count the, I won't start after they introduce themselves.
Got it. Okay. Well, thank you all for waiting. I know we're a little delayed because we had votes, so we'll try to get going and keep moving. And we're not going to introduce anybody this afternoon. We'll just have you go ahead and start and give us your testimony and talk about yourselves, and that'll save a little time from me talking about all of you. You can talk about all of you.
Bujone Shinawe Dug Nagane Muzin Dijnakaz Nagacha Wanang Juba Migizito Dem. Hello everybody. Thank you for this opportunity. In our language, in our way, we're always taught to speak in our language when we introduce ourselves. And I believe that everybody has what Fond du Lac has sent them. So I'm not going to talk what's on the paper because I think everybody has the time to read that and review that. I want to talk about the real issues that are there, not just the things that are on paper. First, I want to talk about CWD, chronic wasting disease. It's severely affected the state of Wisconsin, the lower Wisconsin. It's moving into Minnesota now, which definitely affects our 1854 ceded territory. Minnesota's broken up in ceded territory all the way across the state, the 1854, the 1855, and the 37, which goes into Wisconsin. We spend a lot of money to deal with issues within our natural resource department. This is another pot of money that we're going to have to spend to maintain testing, to do testing, to find a way to get rid of the carcass of these animals. But most importantly, I want to address this issue. If this was beef cattle, chickens, turkeys, or whatever it would be, federal law says you have to wipe out the entire population. So I'm asking why an individual farmer who owns a deer farm or elk farm and CWD is found in it, why are they not wiping out that entire population? It's affecting our way of life, and we here as tribal leaders raise our hand to our people and make a vow to our people. And we can't protect our people if the United States government's going to allow double standards on issues in this manner, which it affects everybody. The question was, we didn't know what CWD really was. We brought in the experts. They sat down with us and told us what CWD is. And for the ones who don't know it, take a understanding of parvo that affects dogs, right? It's a disease that stays dormant in the grounds up to 7 years. Same thing with CWD. It's our way of life. If we can't eat the animals the Creator gave to us, then we cease to become who we are as human beings, as Anishinaabe. This has to be addressed. It has to be looked at on the rebel side of it. There has to be regulations put into place. Who's going to take care of this, and why these independent farms are not wiped out completely? If you have a disease that we don't know how it affects humans, or if it affects humans, because the only way they can test it when the animal's dead. That's a serious issue. We don't know about the birds of prey and the other animals that feed on these dead animals and travel throughout our communities and through the ceded territory. As a trapper, since I was 5 years old, I can't trap anymore. I can, but you worry about it because you don't understand what this is. We are given the deer and the other animals to eat from the Creator. And when we can't eat these animals, it's like rice. If we can't eat the rice, one of my arm leaves. If I can't eat the animals, another arm leaves. If we can't drink the water, one of my legs leave. If we can't take the stuff that grows in the woods that the Creator gave us, my other leaves. I cease to exist as a human being. And these are very, very important things that exist within us right now. It's a big concern that we have. I can't speak for any other band or tribe, but it's a concern. And it's a concern in a manner that we ask why CDC isn't involved. The answer was, if this would be a beef cattle farm, if this would be a turkey farm, if this would be chickens or whatever it is, domesticated that they sell in a store, CDC would be involved. But since they don't sell these animals in stores, the CDC isn't involved. Well, there's a trust obligation from the Secretary of Interior down within the structure of the United States government. My question is, where is the Secretary of Interior to ensure that our treaty rights are being upheld? This directly affects the ones who have treaties and established treaties by the United States government. And the ones who have that ability and that right to hunt, fish, and gather as they choose, this is affecting in that manner to all of us. and it's a big concern from Fond du Lac and the Minnesota Chippewa tribe in whole. So there's 6 collective bands that belong to the Minnesota Chippewa tribe, and Fond du Lac's one of them. And I believe under Gliffwick, all the way to Michigan, actually, we have that right to hunt, fish, and gather all the way to Michigan. And I'm in fear that if it gets to a point where I think it's going, we're not going to be able to eat the deer. And when my family's hungry or another family's hungry, I can't go get them that animal because they're not able to eat it. One of the other things I want to talk about is simplicity, is a Clean Water Act. In Minnesota, well, everybody understands what the federal law is. It's 10 parts per million. It's not being exercised in the state of Minnesota. There's always ways that people are trying to change this regulation. It's simple. If I can't drink the water, nobody can drink the water. If I can't eat the fish, nobody else can eat the fish. How hard is that to understand, and why we're having so many problems to get in this fix and get in the order the way it's supposed to be? We as tribal leaders come and we talk and we write things down, or we have attorneys write things down, and with the same thing comes over and over. I'm here today to just talk to one simple thing. If it's that simple, and it is, why hasn't it changed? If you can't drink the water, I can't. If you can't eat the fish, I can't. So why is this so hard to understand? That we're all human beings, we have a right to eat, we have the right to drink fresh water, and we have the right to breathe clean air. Again, sorry, miigwech. Thank you for your time.
Oh, thank you. Ms. Grusing?
It is Grusing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Valerie Grusing, Executive Director of the National Association of Tribal Historic Preservation Officers. It's NATHPO. We're based in D.C. here, representing a diverse membership across the country. I want to talk to you about just really one of the things that's in my written testimony. And briefly first, I do want to mention an item that we've added new this year. In addition to BLM's reorganization, which has already been mentioned here, was not consulted on. I've recently learned that of the 12 state offices, each of which are supposed to have a tribal liaison position, 10 of those are vacant. And in addition, the headquarters tribal liaison position has been vacant so long it's been removed from the org chart. So one of the things we're requesting is money to backfill those vacant positions. That's part of the problem with what we're seeing with that agency, just a part. But primarily, I want to talk to you about what our members do, Tribal Historic Preservation Officers, or THPOs. They're an exercise of tribal sovereignty. They're appointed by their governments, and they have an agreement with the Department of the Interior, where their funding comes from, to assume the federal compliance role of the State Historic Preservation Officer on tribal land, and also they're available to be consulted on places off tribal land. They do this under the National Historic Preservation Act, and so this funding is in the Historic Preservation Fund, which comes from oil and gas revenues, right? And it's never been fully appropriated at the level that it should be. They're, as I mentioned, an exercise of sovereignty, self-determination. The plans that they have to create to get their funding from the Park Service, it is a grant that they have to apply for to get their apportionment. They're founded and grounded in traditional knowledge and cultural values. And of course, they touch on everything that happens in Indian country. They're the first responders when a sacred site is threatened, when ancestors are disturbed. We all know about that in the news recently. And they're often also responsible for their tribe's oral history programs, any museums or cultural centers that they may have, and the leading revitalization of traditions and languages and many other functions in Indian country. And a lot of times, like myself, they happen to be a one-person show. If they have funding from additional sources, they may have a second staff member. NATHPO, my organization, we're a nonprofit membership association. THPOs may choose to become members, and this is one of the primary functions that we perform, elevating their voice within Washington, D.C., and then helping them coordinate among each other and getting any education and training that they may feel they need beyond what they already have. There's 195 THPOs out of 574 federally recognized tribes. the main thing I want to talk about is funding. So the first year that they received this funding was in 1996, and the average amount that each TIPO received was $80,000. Last year, we received the biggest increase ever from the HPF, and that was $2 million total in the appropriation. That works out to about $5,000 more per tribe. There's more TIPOs every year. So as opposed to that $80,000 in 1996, 185 TIPOs last year got $70,000. So we're going in the wrong direction, even though we have the total appropriated amount increasing. And I have a chart in my testimony that I have here in color for you to see as well. And the important line is the red one. Both the appropriation and the number of TIPOs is going up. But if the appropriation doesn't go up much more than it is, then we've got the total amount that each TIPO gets is flatlining. $70,000 is not even an entire staff person. So this is the gap that we're talking about starting to close. And there's two primary talking points that I want to make. And one is about the importance of the work that the TIPOs do. The epidemics that we see rampant in Indian country are the symptoms of the cause of historical trauma. When you have people that are systematically disconnected from who they are as people, from their heritage, then this is what we have. This is the work that TIPOs do. They rebuild that framework. And the other thing is that if this administration is truly interested in streamlining required environmental and historic review processes, and they are still required, then there has to be somebody there to pick up the phone, and that's TIPOs, and they need funding. We're reminded recently of the importance of place by the ongoing atrocities at Tohono O'odham. Literal destruction of ancestors. History, culture, identity, survival are grounded in place. Our members are charged with protecting those places, but they need support from you in the form of funding to continue the work that they do. Thank you for considering our testimony.
Thank you very much.
I'm Reggie Wasney, Governor of the Cheyenne Arapaho Tribes. We are one of 39 tribes in the state of Oklahoma. I appreciate the opportunity to comment on a land trust and natural resource management. Today I'd like to discuss land in the trust issues. In general, it is my feeling that the land in the trust program still does not expeditiously in the conversion of land held in other than land trust status by tribes or individual Indians into trust status. I'm here today because my tribe has been far less fortunate. Under the Medicine Lodge Treaty of 1867, the Cheyenne Arapaho tribes were assigned that a total of 4.3 million acres of land. Today, we only own about 15 million acres, and of this amount, less than 11,000 acres are 100% owned by the tribes. This greatly limits our opportunity for economic development, cultural preservation, and self-sufficiency. The Cheyenne Arapaho tribes are under the BIA Southern Plains region. More specifically, the Concho Agency, and it is important to note that we are the only tribe in the Concho Agency's jurisdiction. Research going back 40 years has shown that Cheyenne Arapaho tribes have never successfully placed 1 acre of land into trust. While the Cheyenne Arapaho tribes now work cooperatively with the BIA Concho Agency and the Southern Plains Region Agency, still the trust application process has proven to be burdensome due to unnecessary and unrealistic demands and a land description review portion of the application. The Cheyenne Arapaho trust applications are frequently and significantly delayed and then returned because of standards applied by the Bureau of Land Management surveyor, and the rules for land into trust are not enforced uniformly. Over the past several years, the Cheyenne Arapaho tribes have purchased or acquired several properties in fee status that are within our original reservation boundaries. Specifically, the tribes own prime tracts of land along Interstate 40 in Oklahoma and towns of Gary, Oklahoma, El Reno, Clinton, and Elk City. Additionally, we own 2 different tracts in the northwest part of our original reservation in Woodward, Oklahoma, as well as other properties in fee status throughout our original reservation boundaries. Although our tribe has been unsuccessful at placing any land in a trust, the Department of Interior recently allowed the Shawnee Tribe of Oklahoma to place a 103-acre parcel of off-reservation land in trust on land that is contiguous to our original reservation boundaries and land that is 400 miles away from their actual homeland. Specifically, these 4 properties that range in 49 acres in Elk City, 91 acres in El Reno, 1 acre lot block in Gary, Oklahoma, and 18 in Clinton, Oklahoma, have been denied and returned for further corrections, such as name of the tribe, legal description, purpose of use of land, tax concerns, possibility of contamination, 4/10 of a mile away from one property, for instance, but not a report was cited reflective of such a case. We were made to pay back taxes when not required because none were assessed, but BIA required it being done. The solicitor in Tulsa agreed with the tribes that we did not have to pay that. This process, in the meantime, cost the tribes tens of thousands of dollars to fulfill. In conclusion, the Trump administration has gone through great lengths to deregulation efforts to roll back red tape that has burdened Americans and stifled economic growth. Today, I'm asking that the same effort of deregulation also be geared towards the land in the trust process. By making the land in the trust process burdensome for Indian tribes, it is still stifling our economic growth. Many of our tribal nations in rural parts of the country, easing the burden of tribes placed in land in the trust and protect tribal areas and provide an economic boom for not only Indian tribes, but also for the rural communities that are near and within the tribe's reservation areas. At this time, I'd like to thank all of you for allowing me to speak before you as governor of the Cheyenne Arapaho tribes and as governor as a tribal member. So I appreciate it graciously. Thank you.
Ani, buju. Nibana mi kanan bamos indijnikas mangan dodem, shikaning donjiba. I want to say miigwech to the chairman over here for reminding me of the importance to introduce ourselves in that way. And I want to co-sign everybody's comments before the committee, and thank you, Chairwoman and members, for allowing me the opportunity to testify. So I presently serve as the chairperson of the Bay Mills Indian Community, which is one of the 5 member tribes of the Chippewa-Ottawa Resource Authority. Together, our 5 tribes were the signatories to the 1836 Treaty of Washington. That treaty ceded nearly half of the lands that comprise the state of Michigan today. And the enactment, the signing and ratification, rather, of that treaty in 1836 paved the way for Michigan statehood just 1 year later in 1837. But in exchange for the big cession of our homelands, we reserved the right to hunt and fish throughout the ceded territories and throughout the ceded waters in the Great Lakes. Despite enjoying the benefits of that treaty for many years, the state of Michigan did not always respect the rights that our tribes expressly reserved in those treaties, which, as the members of the committee know, constitutes the supreme law of the land under the United States Constitution. In particular, the state of Michigan failed to protect our tribal citizens from violent attacks just for exercising the right to fish, and they even went so far as to arrest and prosecute our tribal members for exercising that treaty right to fish. So before I was born, in the 1970s, the United States sued the state of Michigan to vindicate and protect our treaty rights. And the tribes, together with the United States federal government, prevailed in that case in 1979. It was the United States versus Michigan. Ever since that case, we have negotiated a series of settlement judgments together with the federal government to manage and regulate the exercise of our treaty rights. First in 1985, then again in 2000, 2007, and we are going through the process again of working on another consent judgment. These judgments impose an obligation on the tribes with respect to how we manage and regulate our hunting and fishing rights under our treaty throughout nearly half the state of Michigan. So we have to cover a lot of grounds when we fulfill our responsibilities under those agreements. Now, Congress funds our obligations every year through a line item in the interior budget known as RPI, Rights Protection Implementation. And I want to make sure that I emphasize that the acronym, we're in DC, so a lot of acronyms get thrown around, but that acronym is important because it signals that the funds are to implement and protect the treaty rights. This funding is critical to ensure that our treaty rights, or our treaties themselves, retain vitality for all of the parties, including the United States. And I do want to express the Cora Tribe's appreciation for the committee and the Congress to work in a bipartisan way to continue to provide and protect this funding. Cora is asking that Congress increase Cora's share of the Rights Protection Implementation funding by $1 million to $7.3 million in the coming fiscal year and thereafter. I also want to make sure that I state that Cora understands that there are other tribes in different parts of the country that have similar treaty rights cases regarding fishing and hunting, and some of those folks' representatives will be testifying today and indicate that we also support their requests that Congress meet their funding needs. The extra money that we are requesting going forward will work out to $200,000 per year per tribe. That will fund staff to enforce the regulations that we have to abide by under our settlement agreements in the U.S. v. Michigan case. It will also fund staff and research that protect the Great Lakes themselves. Without a healthy Great Lakes, there won't be any fish to harvest. And without any fish to harvest, the bargain in the treaty itself is hollow. So that research funding through the RPI line item will help us monitor invasive species and contaminants, will monitor the fisheries themselves, and will also allow us to work directly with tribal fishers in the exercise of their treaty rights. So again, I want to say miigwech, thank you to the committee for allowing us to come today and testify on this important issue.
Thank you all very much for your testimony and for taking the time to come and speak with us here today. Mr. Kilmer, have any questions or thoughts? Mr. Joyce.
Thank you all for being here. Certainly, Kevin, I appreciate your comments and understand exactly what you're saying. Certainly, CDW isn't limited to your lands. It's something we're fighting in Ohio as well, and I wish we would get some answers to it. But we're going to continue to fight on all fronts on that. It's and to yourself, Brian, I understand that there's been a consent decree that has been worked out over the years. Is Fish and Wildlife Service continuing to be helpful with their ability to? Are they being constrained by their present budget in helping you?
I can't speak to whether they feel constrained. I mean, really, our goal.
You feel they're helping.
They actually, to their credit, in the current process of working through the next iteration of management plans in this case, they have been helpful so far. I always make sure to include that qualifier, but really, our goal is to work hand in hand with other agencies, including the state of Michigan and federal agencies, to co-manage the resource because it is shared. But first and foremost, as a sovereign tribal nation, our goal is to do it well enough to do it alone if we had to, and so that's really what we continue to push for with this funding.
Again, thank you all for being here, and I yield back.
Thank you, Madam Chair. President Newland, thank you for your presentation. Very well spoken. I really appreciate the fact that part of it was reminding those of us who were born in the 50s that you were born in the 70s.
The 70s were before I was born, Congressman.
Thanks for putting an exclamation mark on it. I can see there are some things that there are no cultural differences about. Governor Wasana, you've talked about land. You've included some stuff in your testimony, and I'm just wondering if maybe one of the things that those of us that represent districts in the West where the United States government owns a lot of ground. Occasionally, we resort to a thing called the lands bill. And since none of this is happening very fast, which is not unusual for Indian country, and we talked about the last panel of that, so I won't put you through that again. But I'm wondering if perhaps maybe your tribes would be a good test case for this committee to say, give us the stuff that you think has been in the hopper for however long. Give us the legal descriptions. Tell us what estate you want, and let's do a lands bill. And if that one works, there's probably some interest for some other sovereign nations. And so even if it took 5 years to get through it, it'd be faster than the present trajectory. And so I'm just spitballing it here, but I mean, it might be something to say, hey, basically, if Congress says we're conveying it to you, you get it in a specific bill. And so, and let me tell you why I'm doing this. It's not because I'm a smart guy. It's because I'm a guy who shares the frustration in terms of how long it takes the federal government to act sometimes, even if they agree with you. And so maybe it's something that's worth a try, and I certainly won't speak for the chair, the vice chair, the ranking member, but it's like, hey, you got, you mentioned the 4 towns, and this one's 91 acres and that. It's like, what the heck? I'm guessing if it was written the right way, you might get it through, and then we'll just see who supports Indian country and who doesn't. But anyhow, food for thought. Madam Historic Preservation Officer, when you were referring to those number of tribes and spots and stuff like that, and that weren't being funded, who was it that you were referring to that wasn't funding them? Was it Parks? Was it BIA? Who was that?
The dedicated funding for tribal historic preservation officers comes from the Historic Preservation Fund,
Okay,
which is in the Interior Bill.
okay.
It's a,
So it's the Park Service.
yeah, Park Service. It's a division of that. So state historic
So if
preservation
we wanted to do
officers also
something
get
about that,
some.
we'd go to the Park Service and go, here's this for that.
The total amount appropriated for the Historic Preservation Fund comes from here. So there's civil rights grants, there's historically black colleges, there's state historic preservation officers. There's a number of pieces of the pie, but it's gotten, I'll be honest with you, disproportionate in the amount of competitive grants. And no one is going to say that something like civil rights grants need less money, but maybe they don't need a 75% increase.
Well,
And then also there's a new pot this year of civil rights grants for all Americans instead of just African Americans. Our members don't have time to apply for additional competitive grants. They just don't. They need an operating budget, and that's what this is.
well, because I got to tell you, I mean, we've got a lot of tribes in Nevada, and we've got a state historic preservation officer in Nevada. And I'm not blaming any of them, but this is the first time I've heard of a tribal historic preservation officer. So if we want to help you,
Right.
that's where we go. Okay.
When TIPOs get funded, it lessens the burden on SHPOs. It's
Gotcha.
less work for state historic preservation officers when tribes can do their own work.
Thank you. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Well, I'll just thank you all for your presentations. I've learned a lot from all of you today, and I concur with everything my colleagues said. I'm on the Agriculture Committee, so we think a lot about diseased animals, and you brought up a lot of good questions. We don't have chronic wasting disease yet in Maine. We have a terrible problem with the ticks on our moose and deer, and certainly fully understand the issues that you're talking about, so I'm happy to do a little more work on that. And thank you for filling us in more about the lack of funding for historic preservation. I'm extremely sorry about what happened on the border wall and the, sort of devastation there. And I'm increasingly interested about this topic. I think we should all be. And I've heard more people discussing it in my home state about who owns tribal artifacts, how to appropriately take care of them in museums, and there's an awful lot of questions that I think should be discussed. So I won't ask you all of them today, but maybe I'll give you a call since you're here in Washington, D.C. So thank you both for your articulate testimony. Hope we figure out a way to get that land back.
I like this idea.
Yeah, that was a good one. And we'll dismiss this panel. Thank you very much for being here today. And
Good job.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. And want to acknowledge my congressman from the 6th District of Washington State. The 6th District, where my grandfather was born in 1877 on Dungeness Spit, a Clallam Indian, with an English father from Victoria. In that year, 1877, his folks, his mom and dad, both perished and was raised by his aunt. 1877 was 12 years before statehood in the state of Washington, and thankfully the United States had a vision of the West that they learned after they came to this country on the shores of the East Coast, and the contact by these people that came to these shores were treated, you know, in a good way, but that westward expansion history of the United States is not very good towards our people. And when they came to the West after Lewis and Clark in 1804 and 1805, they figured they had to do a different way, and there was still a lot of terrible things happening, and we signed treaties in 1854 and 1855. Isaac Stevens was sent out to do that, and that date and time really resonates with me because of my grandfather's birth in 1877. And Billy Frank Jr., who sat at this table many times, and others, talked about the treaties and what it means to us. And he told us at different times that the treaties were signed so that there could be a state of Washington, that there could be cities and counties, there could be municipalities, there could be colleges and universities, but they forgot about us Indians, as Billy's words are always in my ear and in my heart. And this committee right here, we've done a lot of work with over the times, and was proud to say that I worked with Congressman Norm Dix for the 6th, and that we saw great changes in the way we do business around here. And we prevailed in some very tough times in these different presidents and different Congresses, and very happy and proud to say that this committee has stood with Indian country, stood with us when we looked at the quiet crisis and the broken promises, the renewal of the quiet crisis in December of 2018 that my congressman had a voice in. And your support is very much appreciated. To the degree that you've came out to our homelands, and this committee visited us, the chair and the ranking member and others came to our villages, to our homelands, and witnessed what we put on paper, this valuable testimony that we write, what you heard from Cora, what you hear from the Great Lakes, what you hear from our tribes. You know, sitting here for a couple of hours, your heart just pours out in crisis for our people, for our food, for our burial grounds, for our subsistence that is wound into our request here in our written testimony. Complicated agreements between the United States and Canada, Pacific Salmon Commission. A lot of what we do is heavily laden with technical work that needs to be done, and I'm talking about the Pacific Salmon Treaty. I'm talking about the young man that talked about rights protection. You know, you're going to see rights protection in here in a couple of places in our testimony. Pacific Salmon Commission, you're going to see in our written testimony we talk about hatcheries. Hatcheries are more important than ever with the demise of our habitat. Hatcheries, habitat, in order for us to have harvest, We get deep into the weeds of management because we are the co-managers of the resource, the co-owner with the state of Washington, that those treaties the United States said, here to you, your designation document when you became a state in 1889. That relationship requires us to heavily regulated right down the line. And, you know, so this is threaded, what we put in the request is threaded with all these different places that you would see us in U.S. Fish and Wildlife and Parks, and you would see us in Interior BIA. And, you know, I think what we've learned over time is when you look at the staffs that you employ in the relationships, when we come through and talk to you, it's about how do we work together to relay that information? How do we tell our story, as Billy Frank would say? To connect this, you know, to give you the information where you can stand up for the work that you do in this committee, for us Indians, us that rely on that assistance. I don't have much more of a message from that. You know, I go through these talking points and I talk about the pools of monies that's so important, EPA, geographic funds through EPA for Puget Sound, the mass marking, you know, requirements under the treaty with Canada, and assessment work that we can tell what's happening out here in where our salmon go to eventually come home, which is really burdened now by the ever-changing conditions of that habitat, and those things are really troubling, where you see that in these documents when they talk about climate. And I appreciate your time. I really respect everybody that works so hard for us. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Red Star Wolf?
Jeremy Wolf.
Jeremy Wolf.
Jeremy Wolf. Red Star is my Indian name.
I see it's either Jeremy Wolf or Red Star, yeah.
I'm the vice chair of the Umatilla tribe, also the chair of the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission. And I wanted to thank you for assembling this panel, the Treaty Resource Commissions, Intertribal Commissions. We have long histories together, and want to continue those collaborations into the future. So as the Cryptic tribes, it consists of the Umatilla, the Yakima, the Nez Perce, and the Warm Springs tribes. So with the tribes we serve are active managers in an area equal to the size of the state of Georgia, spanning across 3 time zones. So it's quite an endeavor that a challenge that we take on. Collectively, we work obviously on fisheries, but in a more overall sense, it's for our first foods. And we identify our foods with water, fish, deer, roots, and berries. And those also have animals and species that fit underneath them categorically. And those are the water, which serves as the life food for everything. The fish, which are the aquatic species, the deer, which are the terrestrial species that live above the ground, and the roots, plants that grow underneath the ground, and then the berries which survive above. And so those take us in time and space, and we address those not only culturally and throughout the seasons, but we address those scientifically. So we've been able to identify how these are affected. And that goes into climate change resilience, and how we address these things is not only expressed throughout our culture and how we how we gather these things in time and space, but how we can define it and communicate that to the contemporary world as well. Another collective goal that we have is workforce development for our people. So we have over 700 members, 700 tribal employees between the tribes, and it's something that I think that goes to say a lot towards what we're trying to accomplish, not only for the employees but our youth that are up and coming. We want to make sure that we're training our youth as they come up, training our youth as they not only in the workforce, but we also have a salmon camp that we have every year for the middle school. So that's something that we're trying to address so we can speak on these first foods, speak on the things that are important to us. So BIA's Columbia River Fisheries Management budget supports the core fishery program efforts of CRITFIC and our member tribes, which span across 3 time zones as stated. We request an increase of $5 million over the current levels of the new program, of the base budget of $10.7 million. This increase will prioritize support for enforcement, harvest monitoring, implementation of our 4 primary agreements, including the negotiations to modernize the Columbia River Treaty. Columbia River Treaty is something that I'm specifically delegated to as far as CRITFIC goes, and my Umatilla tribe. Been asked to be a part of the most recent Cranbrook negotiations as a technical advisor, and was able to express the first foods that I just briefly described, but also what we have deemed through the regional recommendation, which is a recommendation addressed through not only state but federal and tribal entities. There's 15 tribes are identified, U.S. tribes identified as Columbia River Treaty tribes. Also working with the First Nations, but I think it's really important that the tribes themselves be a part of this negotiation, as we were not a part of the original negotiation. So that's something that's really important that we move forward, because that's going to be the lifeblood. It's going to be the water flows that are necessary in a very unnatural system for our the returns and all that we've invested as far as the fish coming back. Proper ecosystem flows is going to be really important. So this also, I'm going to just touch on a few things here, but climate change resilience is something that I think that is very important for us moving forward. It goes right along with our first foods concepts that we have, and we've had some issues recently concerning first foods, but one thing I guess I wanted to kind of get into is the people that are being affected. And one of the things that goes along with that is the treaty fishing access sites that we have underneath. I want to thank the Congress themselves for Public Law 11699. It's the Columbia River Inlu Treaty Fishing Site Improvement Act. So with that, we will be addressing the sites and O&M funding. We've recently talked with BIA about where those would fit and where those funds would best be allocated. But we also want to ensure that the operating and maintenance monies are addressed as well. So with that, I also wanted to, with the time running out here, just wanted to say that our chair, Kat Brigham, who was supposed to be here tomorrow, just wanted to say that she's, gives her regards, but she's not able to make it. We recently had some devastating floods in the Umatilla River, unforeseen in recorded history. So have a lot of homes that were lost. Had one lady who lost her life, but in the community. But she will not be able to attend. But we did provide our written testimony for that. But it does go to say that it is a part of the changing climate that we have. It's part of and why we need to ensure that we're adequately funded to address those issues. Tribes have proven to be at the forefront of all these issues. So just want to thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Mr. Isham?
Isham.
Isham.
The nuns would say it that way, but I never corrected them, so.
Can't mistake me for a nun.
I'm scared of them. Anin Ogmawag, Ogma Benes Indigena Kaz, Magazine and Dodam, Dawazagaiganing and Dunjaba. Greetings, Madam Chair and Committee. My name is Michael Mick Isham, Jr. I am a citizen of the Lakudere Band of Lake Superior Chippewa Indians, and I'm currently serving as the Executive Administrator of the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, or GLFWC for short. And I want to thank you for the opportunity to testify on behalf of GLFWC. For those of you who may not know us, GLFWC is a natural resource agency that represents 11 member Ojibwe tribes, these areas here in what are now known as Wisconsin, Michigan, and Minnesota. Glifook represents over 43,000 tribal citizens, and Glifook, with our federal and state partners, co-manage the resources in over 32.5 million acres of land. This land encompasses 60,000 square miles of our ancestral homeland, where we continue to hunt, fish, and gather as we have for thousands of years. And in the mid-1800s, the Glifook member tribes entered into several treaties with the United States of America. Our tribes entered into military alliance treaties, not against, alliance, and still to this day we are in the armed forces in large numbers. Besides the military alliance treaties, we also entered into a lot of cession treaties. And in cession treaties, we sold many things to the United States of America, such as billions of board feet of timber, minerals, ports, gravel, and eventually millions of acres of land, which added to and continued to add to the United States Treasury. In those treaties, however, we did not sell and, in fact, specifically retained those rights to use the land, as we always have, hunting, fishing, gathering, as you've heard from the other treaty commissions, and also to maintain our traditional lifeways. And we never sold our sovereignty. However, for hundreds of years or so after the signing of these treaties, and as the states became more established, the opposition to the exercise of our off-reservation treaty rights grew. It took court action in the 70s, before Chairman was born, in the 70s there, 80s and 90s to get our rights reaffirmed. The Gurno case on Lake Superior, the Lacoudere versus Wisconsin case, and the Mille Lacs versus Minnesota court cases all were decided in favor of the tribes. The courts all agreed that the tribe's right to hunt, fish, and gather off reservation was guaranteed by treaty. Another thing the courts all agreed on was that these resources are now shared resources, which also other people had touched on. And so the tribes, along with our state and federal partners, must work together to ensure both state and tribal harvests occur in a manner that does not deplete the resources, and that decisions relative to the land use be done together as well. This is why Glifook was formed. Glifook assists our member tribes in implementing those treaty-retained rights consistent with all those court decrees, such as working with our state and federal partners on harvest quotas and season parameters, along with land use decisions that will help keep those subsistence harvests free from environmental contaminants. Now, for 35 years since Glifook was formed, you, Congress, specifically this committee, has supported Glifook and the other treaty commissions with funding through Rights Protection Implementation line item. On behalf of my family, on behalf of my tribe and all the tribes and families that I represent, I want to thank you all for that support. Chi Miigwech, big thank you. Good science and culturally based natural resource management with a goal of clean and plentiful harvest does not just benefit the tribal citizenry. The people of the Northwoods also should be up here thanking you, because those programs that Glifook administer benefit them as well. The Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, or GLRI, is one program I wanted to specifically thank you for. The Great Lakes, the GLRI, is a very important program for our member tribes, and the congressional language that provides for a distinct tribal program will help ensure that tribes have the flexibility to develop the programs that are highest priorities to their own communities. This bipartisan effort by Congress to protect and restore the Great Lakes will not get much news, although it probably should, because obviously the fighting is what gets the news. But again, certainly it should get some news. Now, before I left for Washington, D.C., we have a tribal Facebook page, and there was a recent post on there with a tribal harvest of walleye, and the heading read, "We will be eating well tonight." And what was most encouraging in that picture was the fact that it was a grandfather, a father, and a daughter that had participated in this harvest. The intergenerational aspect of this activity coupled with the knowledge gained from our Glyphwick biologists that it's a safe and clean harvest and they can eat it, shows the success of our collective efforts. Our success is your success, and with continued support for our RPI line item, the success will hopefully continue for 7 generations and beyond. Miigwech, miu bizindawie, and thank you for listening to me.
Thank you very much. Thank you all very much. Mr. Kilmer, do you have any questions?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Mr. Johnstone, I want to thank you and the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission for your terrific leadership in protecting treaty rights in our region, and for the time you spent with Ranking Member Joyce and with Chairwoman McCollum when they came out to the district. The work you're doing is just so vital in recovering our salmon populations, and I actually do want to thank our chair and ranking member for taking the time to come out and really take the time to understand some of the challenges we face. In your written testimony, you wrote about the salmon and steelhead habitat inventory and assessment program, and I was hoping you could just take a second and talk about how that helps to inform the recovery efforts that the Indian Fisheries Commission is taking the lead on.
Thank you, Congressman, especially for mentioning the Northwest Indian Fish Commission, which I failed to do when I opened up this panel. What it does is it's a shop that's housed at the Northwest Indian Fish Commission, and it's tied directly with our GIS programming. And you know, the dynamics of that, you know, I can tell you what the outcome is, but the inner working is we do a assessment on those watersheds. I mean, that's what that inventory talks about, and salmon and steelhead, and so that gets into the big basic ecology piece of those individual streams. And then we take that into our shop, and we use that GIS programming, and we use our planning, and we put together, it's called the State of the Watershed. It's a document about this, and we're just about ready to roll out the 3rd iteration. And it is in our Puget Sound area in the coast is the document now that the state agencies, the WDF&W, ecology, so forth, and the federal government, it's the Bible. We have done the work. Have you heard Mick say and Jeremy and others that our work is top notch, and that once that's assembled and we put out that document, others don't even try to do it anymore. That's the go-to document, real critical, and you see that in that request, and we had a little bit of trouble maintaining that, and now we've got it well placed in BIA, and you know, it's very important, and we're appreciated that we're in kind of firm ground right now.
Thank you. I'll also just thank you for referencing the great leader, Billy Frank Jr. I have a painting that is just of his face that's in my office, and I'm conscious that he's watching us. So thank you. I yield back.
Ms. Joyce.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you all for being here. And Mick, thank you for your support on the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. And I was just wondering if you could tell us how it's helped the tribal community there, the initiative as a whole. How the funds are allocated, who makes the decisions.
Some of it is capacity.
And whether you're happy with the process.
We're happy with the process. Some of it is capacity money, which allows us to hire some experts that you know, can work on Great Lakes issues. It also helps us get to the table where decisions are made. So it's not like you heard talk about consultations earlier or listening sessions. When you're actually at the table when the decisions are being made, that helps a lot. We do a lot of you know about the project up in Michigan, the Buffalo Reef Restoration Project. We have a lot of money invested in that from our budget, but the biologists and people that work on it, we kind of fund with some GLRI money. Now, the new language that's in the congressional language that's in there talks about a distinct tribal program. And so although it's not up and running yet, we're working on it, and we're hopefully that funding will allow us to kind of tweak the program to kind of fit our own needs instead of trying to fit into what the EPA needs are. You know, all the lakes are different. We're up in Lake Superior, and it's pretty clean up there. So how do you get funding when things are clean? You got to mess it up to restore it. So we pushed for protection and things like that. So, but we'll see where it goes. We're very hopeful with that new language in the bill.
Thank you all for coming.
Mr. Amador?
Thank you all for coming and appreciate your time.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Isham, I appreciate you answering that question because some of our colleagues accuse my colleague here from Ohio of being a one-trick pony for the Great Lakes, and so in good fun. And so now I can help protect him to say, well, I've been in a hearing where, by gosh, you know, blah, blah, blah. So I appreciate you helping him out a little bit on that. And beyond that, I have nothing of more substance than that. So, Madam Chair, I yield back.
That's great. Well, I just appreciate all of your testimony. Thank you so much for talking about issues that are so vital to all of us and for acknowledging the committee's support. I think you find on both sides of the aisle we're very concerned about many of the all of the issues that you brought up with us today and look forward to working with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Perfect, thank you for coming.
Here you go. Ms. McCollum was going to say that too. So.
How are you? Yeah, Bill's upstairs.
Where are you based?
Wisconsin.
Oh, nice.
They're near Ashland.
Are you gonna stay? You can keep doing it.
No, you go ahead. I got a meeting at 4, so
okay.
this makes it a little easier just in case.
I knew you were trying to move things around, so I wanted.
No, this is perfect. Thank you. I didn't mean to make you feel pressured. I would have stayed as long as you needed. See, what have I snuck into your folder here? Just that piece of paper. I think everything else is yours. Yeah, we're just starting the last panel.
Hi, I'm good. It's been a while. Good to see you.
Well, I thought it was.
We've all been working and running around. Shelley and Kilmer have been just wonderful people to move in and out. And David's been doing the same thing. So Stuart.
That's your water. That's my water.
Everybody's been through. Yeah, everybody's been through. Is this yours or mine now?
I just moved yours back.
Okay.
Since I have a cold, I don't want to pass it along unless necessary. Did I steal that from you? I think I did. You got one.
I
Did
got one.
I stole yours. You.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
whichever one.
That was hers. One was hers.
That's fine.
I got my own.
I think we have all the paperwork in order now. Welcome and thank you. This is our last panel of the day, and so I'm sure you heard Ms. Pingree when she was chairing. Just remind people we have a timer, and it's for 5 minutes. And when it goes yellow, you have a minute remaining. And so if you start thinking about wrapping things up, and then when it's red, and I want to thank you for your patience and everything, because with the votes and all that, I know you waited a while to testify. So thank you so much for that. So with that, to speed things up a little bit, I will let Mr. Whitehead introduce himself and go right into his testimony, and then we'll go right down the line. Mr. Whitehead.
Madam Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Bill Whitehead. I'm the chairman of the board of Western Inland River Water System created by the Protected.
We're going to turn your mic on there.
Okay.
Just make sure they're ready.
All right.
Thank you, sir.
I hope I don't have to repeat that.
You're good.
Okay. Yes, we were created by the Fort Peck, Assiniboine Sioux Rural, Tribal Council. I'm also joined by the general manager of the project, Ashley DeFree Weeks, and our tribal attorney, Major Russell. Our project was authorized by Public Law 106, in December of 2000. We are completing construction funding of the project in 2022. We are on the budget and close to the finish line. Our project will be the first in the nation of the authorized rural water project to finish construction. I'm informed that our project is highly regarded by the Bureau of Reclamation due to its adherence to budgets, schedules, federal rules, and quality of construction. Ashley and my board oversee all functions of the project within the Fort Peck Indian Reservation. We operate a safe and reliable drinking water system for 31,000 residents of northeastern Montana, in an area larger than New Jersey and just smaller than Massachusetts, which also covers 4 counties in northeastern Montana. When completed, our water treatment plant will deliver water through 3,200 miles of pipeline on the Fort Peck Indian Reservation and throughout the adjoining Dry Prairie Rural Water System. The project uses our Winters Doctrine water rights in the Missouri River as confirmed by a water compact with the state of Montana in 1989. Dry Prairie is our off-reservation partner, and they have been with us for 25 years. Together we have improved the understanding of our cultural differences, and we work hand in hand in a historic new relationship for a common purpose. I always maintain that our water project, through our treaty rights, enables us to provide water for Indians, non-Indians, Democrats, and Republicans.
Right.
You know, in one of the most cooperative manners that I've ever experienced. Dry Prairie shares in the cost of operating the state-of-the-art facilities. We work together to secure funding for the project. We meet quarterly on project construction and operating issues. Assiniboine Sioux Rural Water is fully committed to maintaining the state-of-the-art infrastructure, which is held in trust by the United States. When Dry Prairie is included, we are delivering drinking water to a joint system valued at $350 million. To meet our responsibilities, the Assiniboine Sioux Rural Water System employs 19 highly skilled tribal members, including certified operators for the water treatment plant and the pipeline distribution system. All federal and state standards for water quality are consistently met. We make emergency repairs to ensure no disruption in service and are proud of that record. As a community organizer for the last 50 years, I recognize and applaud the example our employees are setting for our young people on the reservation, where opportunities have been wanting. Our employees are reliable, dedicated, and service-oriented, highly skilled with modern technology. They are advancing the hopes and dreams of our coming generation. The project is a success at every level, and responsibility is to keep it that way and make perpetual improvements for the benefit of the tribal membership and other residents of northeastern Montana. We rely upon this honorable committee to appropriate the funds we need for our success of the project. We have never been short of funds thanks to the work of this committee. In 2021, the amount needed was $3.2 billion. We thank you for recognizing our needs for the past 10 years of operations for the time you are spending with us. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that upon this successful attaining of funds that you have helped us with our congressional delegation, we have evolved to a point of understanding. When we first started 20 years ago, we didn't recognize that Keystone Pipeline was coming along. And we are very concerned about that. When you take in consideration the 13 schools, 4 hospitals, and the 30,000 people that are, it may not seem like much when you live in an urban area, but out there where we live at, it's so valuable. And I just wanted to put that on record that we are concerned about whatever happens. You know, pipes will break. And I just wanted to leave that with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Francis?
Good afternoon, Chairwoman McCollum, Ranking Member Joyce, and my home state Congresswoman, Ms. Pingree. It's great to see you again. My name is Kirk Francis. I am currently serving as the President of the United South and Eastern Tribes Sovereignty Protection Fund, representing tribes from Maine to Florida to Texas. I'm also the Chief of the Penobscot Indian Nation. We are here today, as we are every year, over the federal government's failings in delivering upon the obligations to tribal nations and Native people. This failure has persisted regardless of changes in administration or Congress, despite numerous reports, investigations, recommendations, and consistent advocacy from Indian country, and of course, the great work of people like that are on this committee. In 2003, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights issued the Quiet Crisis Report, which found that, measured by honor of funding commitments, none of the agencies reviewed met its obligations to tribal nations. In 2003, Congress and the administration had that information and the opportunity to reverse course. Yet the Broken Promises Report issued in December 2018 by the Commission found that the funding of the federal trust responsibility and obligation remains grossly inadequate in a barely perceptible and decreasing percentage of agency budgets. By some measures, since 2003, we have actually lost ground on tribal sovereignty and self-determination. This is not a question about addressing poverty and needs across Indian country. Our relationship with the United States is ultimately about honor, fulfilling commitments and its promises. So when will we truly pay the debt to tribal nations, owed in perpetuity for the extensive lands and resources ceded by our ancestors? Deep and chronic failures require bold, systematic changes. The solutions we offer involve a fundamental shift in federal Indian policy and funding. They will allow Indian country to realize its great potential and create lasting, positive change for tribal nations and our people. Additionally, an appropriately strong and just domestic investment into Indian country benefits America as well. It is critical that the administration propose and Congress demand budgets containing full funding for all federal Indian agencies and programs. Given our history and unique relationship, this funding can no longer be subject to the instability of discretionary spending. In the short term, we are urging the passage of legislation providing advance appropriations for IHS and BIA. In the long term, we must achieve full and mandatory funding for all federal Indian agencies and programs. The processes under which OMB develops budgets and policies that impact us also require reform. We believe a strong Tribal Affairs Office should be created at OMB. In concert with this office, OMB must be required to produce a full, detailed accounting of the funding distributed to Indian country, including only what tribal nations access, not what funds were technically available for them. As our other agencies, OMB must also be subject to the consultation requirements. As Congress once again discusses an infrastructure package, it must include the rebuilding of tribal nation infrastructures and economies. Similar to the U.S. investment in rebuilding post-World War II Europe in the Marshall Plan, the legislative and executive branches should commit to the same investment to rebuild tribal nations, given that our current circumstances are a direct result of the acts and policies of the United States. Regarding our priorities for FY21, we urge the prioritization of the trust obligation in the 302B allocation for Interior. For BIA, our region's funding priorities are included in our written testimony. We continue to be frustrated by the administration's refusal to include a calculation of BIA's unfunded obligations in the budget formulation process. In addition, we join others throughout Indian country in advocating for funding within the Interior and CJS bills for risk management measures to protect tribal sovereign immunity. For IHS, again, our regional priorities are in our written testimony. We are working with other tribal advocates, though, and the IHS to calculate the true unfunded obligations of the agency. We are projected to be far lower than the current figure of approximately 50%. Finally, we urge the subcommittee in the strongest possible terms to provide separate and indefinite appropriation for 105L leasing. Our healthcare should not suffer due to the agency's inability to accurately predict these costs. So in closing, it is time for a comprehensive overhaul of the trust relationship and obligations, one that results in promises kept to tribal nations. Keeping promises starts with ensuring that federal spending better reflects trust and treaty obligations. I want to thank you all again for having me here, and on behalf of our organization, we're happy to answer any questions.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, honorable members of the committee and the Subcommittee on Interior Environment and Related Agencies. My name is Irvin Carlson, and I'm a member of the Blackfeet Nation and president of the Intertribal Buffalo Council. I'm here today to respectfully request an increase of $12,600,000 in funding for the tribal buffalo restoration and management. This amount, added to the current funding level of $1,400,000, will increase funding for the fiscal year 2021 to $14 million. Buffalo are sacred to American Indians. Historical records can indicate that American Indians relied heavily on buffalo for survival. Buffalo provided us food, shelter, clothing, and essential tools. In the early 1800s, the buffalo population in North America exceeded 30 million, and the American Indian population was near 7 million. By the turn of the century, only 500 buffalo survived, and the Indian population was reduced to 250,000. With confinement of Indians to reservation lands, Indians lost their primary food source, lifestyle, and independence. Recovery from this devastation began in earnest in 1991 when a handful of Indian tribes organized the Intertribal Bison Cooperative, now the Intertribal Buffalo Council, to begin restoration of buffalo to Indian tribes. Today, the ITBC is comprised of 69 tribes with populations totaling 1 million tribal members across 19 states with 55 buffalo herds, collectively the largest herd in the United States. ITBC has received federal appropriations since 1992 in the form of earmarks, inclusion in the president's budget, or through DOI administrative action. Funding has been stagnant for many years now, with $1 million for herd development grants and $400,000 for administration, actually for the past 10 years. The Bureau of Indian Affairs has had discretion over the actual amount of funding allocated to ITBC from various line items in the BIA budget. ITBC has worked to create a permanent buffalo restoration and management program within the Bureau of Indian Affairs with an authorization for an annual appropriation. Representatives Don Young, Deb Holland, Tom Cole, and Norma Torres introduced the Indian Buffalo Management Act, and the hearing was held last week before the House Resources Subcommittee for Indigenous People. The administration testified that it agreed with the authorization for an annual appropriation for buffalo restoration and management. At the request of, and I must say at the request of the Department of the Interior, ITBC compared its funding with other wildlife programs. Other programs funding, and primarily the fish commissions, exceeded $140 million from various branches of the federal government last year. This level of funding is largely based on the well-known Bolt decision that awarded co-management over salmon to tribes and states, and that declared the security of Indian fishing rights. A review of the Bolt decision supports all American Indians having a right to their traditional foods, including the return of buffalo to tribes. ITBC seeks the federal government commitment through meaningful funding for tribes to restore, manage, and consume buffalo. Additionally, the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 guarantees tribes access to buffalo so long as buffalo may range. Meaningful funding for buffalo restoration and management provides an opportunity for the federal government to honor this treaty provision. Recently, the United States Supreme Court upheld another provision in the Fort Laramie Treaty regarding hunting rights in the Herrera case. Increased funding will enhance ITBC's herd development grants to tribes for tribal infrastructure, including job creation, fencing, corrals, handling facilities, and supplemental feed, all to provide buffalo to a larger segment of the Indian community. The act will also allow ITBC to enhance technical services to tribes, create marketing opportunities, and for ITBC to serve as a more meaningful partner with other federal agencies in national buffalo management issues. For tribes, the restoration of buffalo signifies much more than simply conservation of the national mammal. Tribes restore buffalo to counteract the near extinction that was similar to the tragic history of American Indians. The killing of the buffalo was an effort to exterminate the Indians. However, buffalo survived, and we are still here. The Indians are still here. Now, we need meaningful funding for the buffalo to again provide food and economic opportunities for Indian tribes. And I thank you for allowing me once again to testify in front of you for buffalo and their increased funding for them. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and members of the subcommittee. I'm Cody Dizitel. I'm the Natural Resource Director for the Cauwell Tribe, also a member there, and I'm here to speak on behalf of the Intertribal Timber Council, who represents tribes across the United States and Alaska. It's a 44-year-old organization that represents 18.7 million acres of woodlands and tribal forests. So from the outset, the ITC appreciates the committee's recognition of the importance of tribal forest management. Your investment in Indian forest management directly improves the lives of Indian people in every region of the United States. Specifically, Indian forest management creates $3 for every dollar of federal funding invested. It employs nearly 20,000 people and manages wildlife habitat, provides clean water and air, and provides sources of culturally important food and medicine for Indian people. Management of Indian forests also generates significant revenue for tribal governments to fund essential government services such as healthcare, law enforcement, and education. For example, my tribe specifically generated $15 million from stumpage revenue a couple years ago. So significant amount of money. You might be surprised that 80% of all timber produced from the Department of Interior lands come from Indian forests. Yet this harvest level is only half of the sustainable annual target set by tribal governments. Imagine what tribes, big and small, would be able to do with twice the revenue and economic activity they see from current funding levels. Indian forestry literally multiplies investments from Congress and makes lives better. Chronic underfunding, however, limits the social, environmental, and economic potential of Indian forestry. Indian forests are funded at 1/3 of the per acre level of the U.S. Forest Service. As such, tribes have forgone over $700 million in stumpage revenue since 1991. For several years, this committee has made modest but much needed increases to BI forestry. Last year, the committee recommended and Congress enacted a $118,000 reduction in BI forestry funding. And yesterday, the Trump administration released its FY 2021 budget justification, which recommends a $1.3 million reduction in Indian forest management. ITC is concerned about the change in funding direction. Our full funding requests are in the written statement, so I'll just mention a few highlights here. The BI forestry account is divided into two parts: the tribal priority allocation and forest projects. We recommend a $5 million increase to each of those. For TPA, a $5 million increase could hire 67 new foresters and increase tribal timber harvest by up to 295 million board feet, creating, assuming, about 15,000 jobs based on our current harvest levels. For BIA forest projects, a $5 million additional investment could reduce the backlog of forest thinning and reforestation that plagues Indian lands. These backlogs deprive Indian communities of vitally needed jobs and income and forest health. I can personally tell you that large wildfires and subsequent replanting will add to the thinning backlog over the next 6 to 15 years. At Cauwell, we had, as our chairman stated to the committee earlier today, we burned 255,000 acres just on our 1.4 million acre reservation in 15. So substantial forest fires and investment needed now. For reforestation, the BIA reports it has a backlog of 263,000 acres, but talking with the chief forester and staff, they're not completely confident in that number, so the number may be more. Every acre that remains on this backlog detracts from the tribe's ability to sustainably manage its forest for ecosystem services and revenue. Indian forests are also impacted by large wildfire suppression and recovery priorities. Tribes have historically struggled to obtain funds fast enough to rehabilitate their forests after wildfire. There's generally a 5-year window to replant after a fire. If that doesn't happen, those lands remain unproductive and become part of the reforestation backlog I just mentioned. ITC recommends a $10 million set-aside within the Department of Interior for burned area rehabilitation, specifically for Indian forests that are burned. Again, as my chairman mentioned earlier, that pot is about $3.2 million nationally now. In just Washington and Oregon, Idaho, In 2015, we saw what was projected by the Department of Interior to be about a $55 million need for that year alone. For RTRL, the ITC also supports increasing DOI fuels management to $206 million. The administration for FY 2021 budget justification appears to request $35 million increase that would bring the fuels account to $228 million. Within this program, the ITC supports the continuation of the Reserved Treaty Rights Lands Program. Tribes use these funds for proactive fuels and forest health projects on neighboring federal lands. To make this program more flexible, we would request that these funds be usable on both federal and trust lands. In conclusion, I want to thank the committee and you personally for the attention you have paid to Indian forest management and its potential to improve the lives of Indian people across the nation. Thank you.
Very much. Ms. Pingree, I know you have a meeting coming up. Do you want to take the first question?
Thank you very much. Well, thank you all for your testimony. You're all talking about resources that I think we feel very committed to support, and I hope that the chair and the ranking member will pull in a considerable amount of money this year so we can fund more of the things. And I particularly appreciate Kirk Francis, Chief Francis being here today. Thank you for the great work that you do in Maine. And I really enjoyed hearing your testimony because you didn't hold back and you were there in the strongest of terms about all of the obligations that we're not meeting at this point. And we know the devastation and damage that does. So I think we'll work very hard this year to see what we can do. And thank you again for being here.
Thank you all for being here, and I too, President Francis, appreciate and am curious a little bit about your commentary on reforming the OMB. You probably have some friends up here on the panel who agree with you on that. And I was just wondering how you think we can make them account for the funding to show that they're being fair to Indian country and the things that they're doing in, maybe an annual GAO report would be helpful, but I'm curious to hear your insight onto this.
So, one of the things we've been trying to do at USET is work very hard on, just trust modernization, but also being able to quantify what is exactly getting to Indian country. How are the resources you're all working hard to appropriate? How are those being used? And when you look at the $3 billion BIA budget, for example, and we have an Interior right now that refuses to participate and doesn't think it's their responsibility to show that they're impacting tribes in a positive way or meeting their treaty obligations and trust obligations, rather. So that's concerning, in not being able to understand where the unfunded needs are and all of that. But to your question, at OMB, we'll get a cross-cut from them that will say $21 billion went to Indian country, for example. That's not really reflective of exactly what's getting to Indian country, because you might have $3 billion of that went to states in block grants and or other things that tribes didn't know about. Now, in our region at USET, this is prevalent because relationships in the Northeast with states and tribes is one that's growing still. And so I think tribes may not even understand those resources are in the state, so they may not be getting access to those. So we think we would just like a more detailed accounting from them of exactly what tribes are accessing, not what they were eligible for. And their stance on consultation is the executive orders don't apply. And so it's been challenging to sit down and really get that kind of accounting. So I think we need more focus on exactly, and I'm sure the committee would be concerned about, between BIA and IHS, where's the $9 billion going? We know it's not enough, but we need to know exactly how you're spending it to meet the needs of Indian people with those, and that's not happening right now.
Well, I wholeheartedly agree with you that we need to have better oversight and of how it's being spent, and I think we'd find some agreement here that we'd like to work with you and OMB and trying to get to some bottom line so we can better analyze where it's going and how it's being spent. So thank you all again for being here.
Mr. Whitehead, I just have to admire your suit coat there. My grandfather had one, but it was black. And used to take me perch fishing up and around Fort Peck. So thank you for being here, and congratulations on all the work that you've done in the community to provide water for not just tribal nations, but for your neighbors. And we see your needs list here, so thank you for that. And I think, Mr. Joyce, you kind of summarized what I was going to say to President Francis here. I mean, we know that we aren't, if our allocation, for example, our subcommittee's allocation doesn't get any bigger this next year, we're going to be fighting just to keep on what we have and that we don't get cut. And that's not something that makes the members on this committee, as you know, both Democrats and Republicans, very happy, because we want to see progress moving forward. But the idea of really putting numbers down and seeing where they're going, I think, would be very helpful to this committee as well, too, when we ask questions, when we ask for school lists, when we ask for construction projects. We sometimes find ourselves not receiving the information we've requested, and then consultation as well, too. I'm not a big fan of executive orders either, so I share your pain with those. Mr. Carlson, you're adding more school lunches to with the Buffalo. Congratulations.
We're trying to do that, get it out to our people to get back to healthy.
I do my share of eating buffalo when I'm back in Minnesota. We had a hearing on chronic wasting disease, and right now it does not seem like it's affecting buffalo herd, but just knowing that it's in Minnesota, kind of going west. Is that anything that you feel that more research or anything needs to be done on?
Well, I think it would really help. It would really help, I don't see it coming, it hasn't affected any
Right.
of our animals yet. But you never know. I mean, it is moving west, and would be a concern, and be devastating if that, got into our herds
So
also.
far, so good.
Mhm.
None in Buffalo, but as we know, sometimes these diseases, sometimes all of a sudden will spring a surprise on you and, crossover. One of the things that I asked some of the other people on forestry is climate change is a concern. Climate change and invasive species sometimes go hand in hand. Sometimes it's just invasive species on their own. What you brought up with fire, I think, was a little surprising to me. I'm going to look more into the backlog on that. So could you go over again what happens if it's not, you've got 5 years to replant, and then it goes into a backlog? What's special about those 5 years that it didn't go into a backlog right away?
So BIA is allocated a certain amount of funding for burn area rehabilitation, but you're only eligible for that funding for 5 years past the containment date. If it isn't accomplished during that 5 years, then it just gets added to the BIA backlog, and that can be reforestation or thinning. But what we've seen across the West, and it compounds every year, so if you have a big year like you did in 2015, there's $3.2 million that were allocated for that year, but the BIA speculated that there was a $55 million need, and if you look at that $3.2 million over the next 5 years to support that, you still wouldn't have had enough money, and that assumes you don't have any fires over those next 4 years. So what we tend to see is a compounding of unmet needs in Indian country, and for those forested acres that were forested and don't see post-fire rehab, they tend to come back to something other than forest, and they just don't contribute to the natural resource goals of many tribes. They want those to be perpetually productive forests, providing clean water, clean air, cultural plants, all the things that are important to tribes.
That's good to know, because with the fire fix, part of what we want to do is fix some of the other things that the Forest Service kept borrowing from. And as you know, forestry has a bit of a foot in this committee and also on the Ag Committee. So Ms. Pingree and I are on the Ag Committee as well, too. So we will be watching to see how that balances out. Thank you for bringing that to my attention. I didn't realize that. So that's what I love about these hearings. I always learn something. So thank you all for coming. Thank you again for your patience. It's not fun waiting around while we're off on the floor voting. So this concludes the afternoon hearing, and we stand adjourned until tomorrow morning's hearing begins at 9 a.m. Thank you.